What I thought I'd tell you a bit about is some of the efforts in organic solar cells. And so in my lab, we do a lot with organic materials. And so most semiconductor devices that are used in high-performance electronics are made on things like silicon wafers or other types of wafers, depending on the material system. And what happens is, right, they're built in very expensive fabrication facilities like this. And even if you go away from silicon and you look at flat panel displays, they're built in equipment that looks like this. This is a CVD chamber that's used to deposit amorphous silicon on very large, many meter on a side substrates. And there are people there to give you a sense of the scale. And so the mechanization of electronics is quite extreme. What organics sort of promise is this idea that if I went to these organic-based materials, I could dissolve them in a solvent, a carrier solvent, or maybe I could deposit some of these by vapor as well. And the idea is you could use technologies like inkjet printing or roll-to-roll printing to increase the throughput and really decrease the cost at the size of the factory that you're going to use to make these sorts of devices. And then maybe we're going to have new functionality as well that will come from this. Now, over the years, what we've seen is we've seen kind of a progression in the performance of organic semiconductors. And I put this up just to give you a sense of where things are at. So what's happened is we know a lot about amorphous materials like these triarylamines that have charge carrier mobilities in transistors down at 5 × 10⁻³ or so. And over the years, we've seen this steady march by molecular design to move up to different types of conjugated backbones with different types of solubilizing groups, where the carrier mobilities, at least in electrical devices like transistors, are getting quite high. There are actually now reports of materials that have a carrier mobility above 10, actually, which is quite large. It's higher than amorphous silicon. And so basically, we can, by tuning molecular design, really tune the electrical properties of devices. And a lot of this, we believe, is due to ordering that actually happens in thin films. Now, today, I'm not going to talk about transistors, but I'll show you some examples, right? So organics have now moved into a lot of arenas. So here's basically transistor circuits and organic light-emitting diodes on flexible displays. You can see this video of this from Sony on YouTube these days. There are handsets now that you can buy that have organic light-emitting diodes. There's some activity here. I was talking to Professor Wong about this, about photodiode arrays and the like that we used to work on at Park. And solar cells, right? And so what's happened is now the technologies in these two things are kind of the same. The idea that you have an organic material that's highly colored, absorbs light strongly, and you can get charge out. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. If I look at all the solar cell technologies there are, I'm not going to try to convince you about why we need solar energy. It's good to have alternative sources of energy, clean, renewable energy. And there are lots of options, right? This is a famous chart from NREL you can get on Wikipedia that a few years back wasn't so unwieldy, but now due to the intense interest in solar again, like this chart, it's gotten so dense it's actually difficult to read. And what you see here, there are everything from multi-junction cells grown by things like molecular beam epitaxy to thin film technologies and emerging technologies. Okay, and so what I'll do is I'll zoom in a bit. So I'm going to talk about thin film solar cells, the class that organics are in. And if I look at thin film cells, right, we have things like SIGs that have relatively high power conversion efficiency. But down here, organic materials are kind of the upstart, and they're in a steep climb over the years, as now the efficiency of organic solar cells is above 10%. And actually, you can do 12% in tandem vapor deposited organic cells. And so what's happened is they've kind of gone from being sort of not so interesting to now being competitive, at least in lab test cells, with technologies that like amorphous silicon, and they're actually exceeding the performance of amorphous silicon in some cases. Okay, and so what I want to tell you about is a few stories about what it takes to bring solar cells from the efficiency from here to here, and some of the material science and device physics that goes on in doing this. When you look at that, right, it's kind of a cheat. Every other line on that chart is one material. And the difference in organic materials is that there are lots of materials, okay? So there are many, many different structural variations. And so when you see that increase in performance, it's not that someone is working on one material. It's a class of materials that people are developing. Most of the efficient, what's called bulk heterojunction organic solar cells, which I'll define a bit in the next slide, have polymers in them. And they also have a fullerene molecule. So it's a mixture of two things, okay? And so the structural diversity tends to come from the polymer side, and this fullerene tends to be relatively constant. Cells are efficient. They're efficient absorbers out to about here, maybe 750, 800. And there's a lot of push to try to increase the absorption, to try to increase more coverage of the solar spectrum. Okay? And that's where a lot of the scientific challenge is. So today I'll give you a sense of how these things work, because they're a bit different than conventional p-n junction solar cells. So what are called bulk heterojunction solar cells were invented in UCSB by Alan Heeger and Fred Woodall. And what they found, and they didn't necessarily intend to do this, was that they took basically a polymer like this poly-3-hexylthiophene, and they mixed it with a fullerene in solution and cast a film of it and put an electrode layer on the bottom where one contact has an electrical level such that it can accept holes. It's lined up with the highest occupied molecular orbital or valence level of one of the materials. They have an electrode on the top like aluminum that has a lower work function that's lined up with this fullerene. And the idea is that you shine light on the material, and this is a stronger absorber. The light is absorbed here, and you get an electron transfer event. The hole stays in the polymer. The electron stays in the fullerene. Schematically showing the energy levels here. So the hole moves in this, the electron moves in that. They're all mixed together. You collect them at the electrodes, electrons to the top in this case, and holes to the bottom. And you get reasonable solar cells. This is a 4.5% efficient P3HT PCBM solar cell. The excitement, why do you use fullerenes? Well, it turns out this electron transfer process is ultra fast, so that's good. But what's actually happening in these cells? Well, let's look at a solar cell curve if you're not used to looking at that. Okay, so if I have, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a mixture of these two things in solution and maybe a 1-to-1 by mass blend. I coat them with a solvent, let the film dry. And we get a phase separation in these layers such that it's quite small. It's basically, you have nanoscale, let's say maybe 10 to 20 nanometer domains in an efficient cell of both of these things. Okay? And when you look at that, the reason you need that is because the optical excitation in this material just doesn't move very far. The charge generation only happens at a molecular interface of these two, and that's very critical for the short circuit current. You want to absorb as much light as possible and extract them out to the electrodes. And with a particular incident amount of radiation, the short circuit current is set by how many of those photons that are absorbed can be converted into electrons and holes and then pulled to the electrodes. Okay? And so that's very critically depends on the interface area of the two materials, since the only time you get charge is when those two things meet. Now, to schematically show this, right, these are drift-based cells, right? So there's an electric field by the contacts. And so the idea is this. So I have a bulk heterojunction here. These are my polymer chains and my fullerene. And what happens is they're in a ground state, and you form an exciton. It's a localized excitation. And maybe it sits on the polymer, and the excitation can walk around. If it finds its way to an interface within its lifetime, it can separate. Basically, you can get a hole and an electron in the two phases. And what will happen is this state could be something called a charge transfer state. And I draw its energy here because people argue about exactly what energy it has at that interface. And then those charge carriers will drift apart in the electric field set up by the electrodes. Okay? And then they'll go downhill in energy basically to something that's related to the electronic levels of the donor, which is the polymer, and the acceptor, that's the fullerene. Okay? Now, when I look at that, right, so that electronic level difference between these two materials sets this open circuit voltage, right? This sets how much voltage you can get out of the cell. It's the point where the light current and the dark current are equal, right? When I bias this device, right, eventually it'll turn on like a regular diode, and only when I'm generating, it's parasitic because the photocurrent's going the other way. And when those two things equal each other, you'll get this maximum, basically, voltage you can get out of the cell. Now, the other thing that matters, right, for power conversion efficiency is basically where the maximum power point is. You'd operate a solar cell where you can extract the most power from the device. And that's here. That's how I just multiplied J times V to get that number. And we use a metric called the fill factor to keep track of that. And the fill factor is defined if I take the short circuit current. Should be actually right on top of that. It's my power pointing. If I make a square between the open circuit voltage and the short circuit current, the fill factor is basically how well I can get this max power point, how far away that max power point is away from this point here. You can never get 100% by the laws of physics, but you can get pretty close. Okay? These are fill factor of about 71%, which is about as high. You can go maybe to 75, I've seen some cases in organics, but not much higher than that. Okay? Now, what sets what this point is, right? So here, if I have a big electric field between the electrodes, as I'm here, it's very easy to pull the charges out. if I'm actually here, as I move this way, the electric field across the device is actually decreasing. And so what that means is the time it takes, the transit time for the electron and the hole to get out is increasing. And so as the time is increasing, they have more time to recombine. And so this point is basically a trade-off. It's basically related to the transport, how long you can keep these carriers alive for and how long it takes them to get to the electrodes. Okay? And typically the fill factor is the most difficult thing to control and understand. What do these things look like, right? I said they're nanoscale phase separated. If you stick a solar cell like this and you spin coat in a TEM and you do something called TEM tomography, where you try to look at the electron density contrast between the two phases, you see images like this. And typically people will just show one phase. We don't know that this contrast is perfectly due to pure domains of one material or the other. We just know there's a lot more electron density here than in the black parts. And so what the scale bar here is, these are maybe 20, 30 nanometers, but there's some cutoff that people use in TEM tomography. So you don't know how abrupt these interfaces are. So you have to be quite careful. But just to give you a sense of this, right, these are very complicated networks that the charge is coming out of, right? It's not like there's this perfect path, straight line path between the bottom and the top, right? The charges have to fight their way through this very complicated looking network. Okay. Now, it's a bit tricky. So if you ask yourself, well, I have these kind of goopy looking things, right, and they're small, you know, is there any order in these cells, right? So this is on a larger length scale. This is, you know, these are 100 nanometers, and this is maybe 500 nanometers across. If I zoom in and I ask the question, if I had a pure domain there, is there much order? So just to give you a sense of this, so if I take semiconducting polymers, a classic one is poly-3-hexylthiophene, and I do an experiment called grazing incidence diffraction, where I take a thin film and I scatter X-rays off of it, and I detect them with a plate, what I'll see is a number of diffraction peaks here. If I had a powder, I'd just see rings. I don't see rings. What I see are peaks along this axis and some peaks along this axis. And so when I look at a polymer structure, they tend to pack like this, where this is a backbone. And these are the side chains that make it soluble, so I could dissolve that material. And I could imagine I could have crystallites that are oriented with the A-axis up. I could have them A-axis in plane. It's very hard to get the other axis, C-axis, up because of the chain length. So typically you get one of these two structures. We call this one edge-on. We call that one face-on, where the substrate is down here. And if I go look, right, if I look at the diffraction pattern, I would see spacing from the A-axis if I was face-on down here, and I do. I see that. And I see this distance, we call the pi stacking, the separation between chains here, and that's up here. The edge-on stuff is more ordered. So the crystallites that are edge-on, you see more diffraction peaks and more intense diffraction peaks. So of the material that's crystalline, you know, the crystallites that are oriented this way are a little bit more ordered. Okay? But what I do is I have two populations, and you see that right away from images like this. So that's in a pure material. So that's typically what you see. Now, if I look at this bulk heterojunction, right, I'm doing this interesting thing where I kind of have a biphasic material where I have a blend of this material and this material. And so I take the same kind of diffraction pattern of this, I see some peaks that look like what I saw on the previous slide. And I can assign them, right? So I see the poly-3-hexylthiophene peaks there. But then I see this broad band here, okay? And that's the fullerene, okay? So this fullerene that mixes in to the polymer ends up being amorphous. If you look at the peak width there, it's actually very broad, and you'd get a crystallite size or correlation length of only a couple of these fullerene molecules. So it's very glassy. Okay. We know this for sure because if you made a crystalline version of this material, you'd see nice diffraction peaks as well. So this would be a neat film of PCBM. You don't see a combination of that picture I saw in the previous slide and this. What you do is you see these broad rings. And so what happens is in those TEM images, you can imagine the polymer is there, and it does have domains that are highly ordered, but the fullerene that's in between is just glassy, right? And that's easy to see. It's kind of like a ball. You can kind of think about the fullerene that way. And so you see significant disorder in this phase for sure, and actually a bit of disorder in the polymer as well. It's not like a piece of silicon. Now, what's known for a lot of systems, and I'll use this system as a model system because I think it's good for a general audience. This is the system that people have spent the most time studying. Okay, it's the first one that worked efficiently. Doesn't get power conversion efficiency of 10%, but it's a good model for behavior. And what has happened is you cast these things, and the processing matters quite a bit. You spin coat these films, and you can make a solar cell with maybe 1% efficiency. But then you heat this material up, and you make another solar cell, and you heat the film up, the efficiency goes up 5x. That's a huge factor, right? 5 times more efficient. In solar cells, right, this is a huge number, right? You don't get many, many orders of magnitude usually. You get linear factors. And so you ask the question, well, what happened between here and here? For a long time, people argued about this, and they said, well, this material is crystalline, this one's not, maybe this one needs to order, it's impeded by the presence of the fullerene. And it was tough to understand because you have this complex nanophase morphology. And so we came along a few years ago and said, well, this is too hard. Let's do something simple. And so we tried to do a classic kind of material science experiment. At the time, people said that the fullerene wasn't very miscible because you would form, if you heat this thing too long, you'd get crystallites and see huge phase separation. But we were curious. We were convinced that there was probably a little bit of fullerene that was getting into the polymer. And so what we did was we made a classic kind of diffusion couple experiment where we cast a film of a deuterated version of this fullerene, and we can float cast, basically we spin coat a film of P3HD. We can lift it off on water and land it and make a very sharp interface there. This is kind of a standard technique in polymer science, in polymer thin film science. We can make this bilayer. And so we get a layer like this, where just to show you, this little ratty on the edges, we just break the wafer. It's fairly uniform. And what we do is then we take this carefully prepared sample, and the students then go off and destroy it. So what they do is they do dynamic sims. And so what you do is you look at this layer and you depth profile it by sending in ions with an oxygen gun and measuring the secondary ions coming off. What you see then is basically we'll just look at the deuterium signal from this and the sulfur signal from that, just to give you a sense of that. And what you find is in this bilayer, as prepared, you see both phases. You see the PCBM layer at the bottom. You see the P3HD at the top. Now what happens? Let's heat this up. So you start heating it up. And when we first did this, it was quite surprising because everyone said, well, they're not miscible. But we heat up at low temperatures, much lower than this 150 C that people use. And suddenly we start seeing some deuterium in what is the polymer region. And we heat it up some more, and then we see a lot more fullerene. And then we heat it up some more at the temperature everyone uses, and it's uniform. It's all fully mixed. Okay? This was a very simple experiment, and no one had actually done it at this point. And it's been repeated by a lot of other groups nearly at the same time. And there's some stories there about why that happened I can share afterwards. But what we found was that this thing is really miscible, right? These two materials really just do intermix at very low temperatures. If we look at this in detail, right, you may be scratching your head a bit because you say, well, I know something about diffusion. And you say, well, it's interdiffusing at low temperatures. Maybe that's not so weird. But there's no concentration gradient. It's flat, right? Normally, you think if there's Fickian diffusion and you would stop this at some time scale, you'd see kind of a profile. But the fullerene is flat. We did this, tried to sort this out. No matter how fast you quench the sample, you could never get a diffusion profile that looked kind of Fickian. We could actually do this now with laser step annealing, where we can actually do that. But the time scale to do that is sub-millisecond. Okay? What that tells you is the fullerene diffuses extremely quickly. Okay? And I'll show you some more quantitative numbers later. And you get kind of this mixture that you actually see in the blends that work well. So it was quite interesting to us. We repeated this for other polymers. Everyone always asks, I'll show it. You can do this with what are called low bandgap polymers. We see this general phenomena that the fullerene will actually diffuse into all sorts of materials that you wouldn't have thought it would. Now, when I look at this, right, I can do diffraction now. It's kind of nice. We go to the synchrotron at Stanford, and we make a bilayer like this, and we say, well, everyone said that the fullerene will impede the P3HT crystallization. But as we do this, we heat this thing up, and what happens is the P3HT polymer just doesn't care very much. It just keeps crystallizing like it wants, doesn't change structure. The fullerene, you go from this bilayer to something that's fully mixed, and then eventually you heat it long enough, and the PCBM decides to crystallize and make big crystals. Okay. Now, when we look at this, right, we can confirm this in other ways. We can actually basically do depth profiling. We can sit at the top and basically heat the film and watch the fullerene diffuse in, where we're doing kind of surface-oriented scattering. So we do this a lot of different ways. We've done this where we flip this. It's not an effect of having the fullerene on the bottom or the top. Doesn't matter. Okay. Now, what's funny about this is when I look at the diffraction, what you find is if we look at the rocking curves in this is the orientation of the crystallites. And I would have thought if I had this very dramatic change, right, if I go from something that's flat, something that's fully mixed, you might imagine if I have physical crystallites, they're going to move, right? You might imagine, if I'm going from something like this to fully mixed, something ought to happen. Nothing happened. We don't get no change in the orientational distribution. And so that says that some of this material in the P3HT is amorphous, and we think that we saw this right away, and we decided that the fullerene had to be going through the amorphous fraction of this polymer. We could also see this in other ways. So we actually did this experiment, which again we were surprised no one had done. And what we do is we measure the solar cell in situ while we heat it. And we actually see at temperatures right when we know the fullerene diffusion goes in, that's exactly when the short circuit current, all the improvement in the solar cell performance starts to happen. Right? It actually shoots up very strongly, just right nicely around when the fullerene diffuses. And so this was telling us that this fullerene diffusion is one of the most important processes in getting these solar cells to work. Now, when I look at it, and I say to yourself, what happens? Actually, the polymer, as we see here, the part that's oriented edge on, is getting a little more intense. But we actually see a big difference with the face-on portion. It's becoming, this peak here is becoming more intense. And so it actually is crystallizing. And it's OK, because the fullerene diffuses around very quickly. So when the polymer wants to crystallize, the fullerene just gets out of the way. OK, it's got no trouble getting out of the way. When you look at that, right, we also have been saying, well, it doesn't go in the crystalline phase. And we say this. And people don't have trouble wrapping their head around that sometimes. If I look at the ordered part, just as a cartoon, the chains line up a bit like this. The fullerene accurately is about this size. And so basically, there's no space for this fullerene to actually make it in the ordered chains, right? The disordered region, you can imagine this chain is actually pretty flexible. It wraps around. And the fullerene can just kind of dissolve in to the side chains, we think. Okay, but it's hard to prove exactly where it's at. We can also do this other ways. You're kind of beating this into the ground at this point. So what we found was we needed a nice measurement to back out the diffusion constant. We'd always been measuring SIMS vertically, right? And so we can't quench fast enough. And so the solution to that is, well, if we can't go fast enough, let's add more distance. And so we can actually do an experiment where we make a bilayer of the fullerene and the polymer and just measure laterally using our SIMS, because we can do imaging. So the scale bar is funny here. So this is only hundreds of nanometers this way and hundreds of microns the other way. We can actually watch the fullerene diffuse laterally, huge distances. Okay? And when you do this, you can now back out. You get kind of diffusion profiles, which I won't show you, that look reasonable, look Fickian. And then at some point, you hit a regime where you actually get Boltzmann-Montano type diffusion, where there's concentration dependence or volume fraction dependent diffusion, where we can see this as a function of temperature and composition now. And what we see actually is a quite strong diffusion, but it's fast, just like we predicted from our bilayer experiment. And just to give you a sense of this, if you don't look at these numbers all the time, that means when you're at these temperatures, the fullerene can go 300 nanometers in a second. Most people anneal these for like 5 minutes when they do these steps. So the fullerene is just moving around. It's basically insolvent, at least in these polymers. It's not the same in all polymers. In some of the other low gap polymers, you have to go to higher temperatures for this to happen. But you really have to imagine this glassy fullerene moving around at temperature, at will. And so what this says is that when we look at these cells, when we anneal them, what's actually happening is the polymer domains are crystallizing. The PCBM is actually moving around quite rapidly. But what it also forces you into is it says, well, there's going to be some pure domains of P3HT. That's the crystalline part. There's going to be some aggregated PCBM that you can see in TEM. But then there's also going to be some molecularly mixed domains, too. And so when we think about the bulk heterojunction, you have to think about it like there's not just two things in there. There's actually two things in an impure phase in the middle, which in retrospect should have been obvious, but it was not a couple years ago, not the standard picture. So this very rapidly became what everyone is interested in. And so there are a number of groups that reproduce this. I think everyone agrees. Now you say to yourself, what can I do with that? I want to make cells better. So if I go take a material like this, so if I take this poly-3XL5-phene, I do something real simple. I have a collaborator, Martin Heaney, in Imperial College, who can make these selenophene polymers. They have the exact same structure as P3HT. Adding the selenium doesn't change the packing structure very much. But it does change the optical absorption. Okay? It goes to lower band gap, and it has a better absorption, or has a different overlap with the solar spectrum. And so you might expect these solar cells to be a bit better. But what always happened is that they kind of worked on this, and they used the same acceptor all the time, and the solar cells were never better. And they were always worse than the P3HT case. All they did was change one atom, and suddenly they just can't make a solar cell. There were like 6 papers written on this, where they've never increased the fill factor, which really reduces the efficiency of this material. So we said, well, there are a lot of other fullerenes around, and people tend not to use them, because this fullerene PCBM that I keep showing you is the one that tends to work with everything. And there were empirical correlations around for other fullerenes, but it really wasn't so sure what to do to change that. So we said, well, I asked Martin to give us some material, and we just tried some experiments. So we actually measured the miscibility of the PCBM in this material, the same way we did before, had similar diffusion constant and so forth, and similar behavior qualitatively. But what was happened was we found out that it actually was much more miscible actually in the P3HS. So somehow the interaction with the heteroatom or the crystallinity was such that in general samples of this tended to suck more fullerene. And what it said was that meant we had more miscible fullerene around. And that's not good, we figure, for transport. And that was probably the origin of the poor fill factor. So I went to my colleague Fred Woodall, who's right down the hall, and one of his students had some different fullerenes. And what was nice about them was he actually had ones with different side chains on them, which we thought would affect immiscibility. And so they made us these compounds with deuterated versions. It's nice having someone that can do that down the hall. And so we measured ones with longer side chains, less long, or slightly shorter, and even shorter side chains. And we looked at the miscibility of these at temperatures that we know led to reasonable solar cell performance. And so we said to ourselves, well, let's just pick the one we would predict up front that the one that had similar miscibility to PCBM in the other polymer should work here. So we went off and made a lot of solar cells. And sure enough, if we do TEM, and maybe a little blurry, it's blurry from my angle here, sorry about that, where what we found was that the imaging of the domains kind of tracked that solid state miscibility that we were measuring with SIMS. And we found one where this one was not soluble at all, would precipitate out too well. This one would mix too well, and the one in the middle was again, somewhere in the middle. And so we thought, well, the one in the middle ought to work. So then we went and made solar cells with these. And sure enough, what happened was the student did this very apples to apples. He tried to keep all the processing the same just to look at the role of the fullerene. And sure enough, we got a big jump in the fill factor. The short circuit current varied a little bit. If we put error bars on this plot, they would be about the same. But the fill factor was always substantially higher. And we got a jump in the power conversion efficiency that was solely due to the fill factors. A little bit of VOC improvement, but not much. And then when we look at the other fullerenes, we always saw reduced fill factors with the other side chain lengths. Okay? And what we found was that it correlated pretty well with our hypothesis that you had to have a certain amount of miscible fullerene and a certain amount of the precipitated fullerene. And so when we looked at this, we said, well, how are we going to model this? So we did something very simple just to start with, where if we look at a solar cell, and the fill factor is mostly about charge carrier collection efficiency. So you can use something called the Heck law, which tells you about the fraction. If you just assume that the fraction of charge collected is related to the mobility lifetime product here, meaning how fast they are versus how fast they move versus how long they last. If we take a look at this, you'd expect that if mu tau was independent of light intensity, you're going to be trap dominated. If it's dependent on light intensity, then you have bimolecular recombination. And if I look at this, as I increase mu tau, you get higher and higher fill factors. This is a standard analysis used for a lot of photodetectors. When we did this, we actually looked at the mobility lifetime product as a function of light for these cells. And what you see is that the ones that are more miscible have this rather steep dependence of mu tau on light intensity. So this is kind of a surrogate for charge concentration. And the one that performed a little bit better, that was a little less miscible, actually was a little more flat. You'd expect if it were just trap dominated, it would be completely flat. But you never quite get there in a lot of these cells. So we see a steep change in the recombination mechanism between the two. Now this stuff is not written in stone now. So everyone is arguing now about why these sorts of things happen. And so this is active. So this field moves extremely fast. So people change this picture, sort of monthly based on arguments at conferences. And so what's emerging, there's a number of us who kind of like this picture. It was first put in print by the Imperial group, where if I have polymer domain here and I have fullerene domain here and a little bit of mixed stuff, you can do some measurements and convince yourself that the transport levels of the fullerene, when they're mixed in here, are going to be a little different than the aggregated amount, because the dielectric constant is a bit different in there. And so there might be this benefit of having this mixed fullerene that effectively you're pushing the charge out as long as you have some aggregated network to go there, and it'll slow down the recombination. Okay. Now, we don't know if this is true, and there's arguments pro and con on this. But what we think is that this complex morphology is really can be beneficial, right? A lot of cartoons will show you want pure polymer and pure fullerene, but it's not so obvious that that's the best structure. That structure has always been asserted as desirable, but it's never actually been shown that that structure is beneficial. Okay. Whereas every solar cell we think looks more like this. Okay. Now, when you look at this, right, this is tricky, right, because I'm going to look at charge extraction from this thing. And I'm going to make this big assumption, right, So I have a polymer that has two transport levels here. So this is density of states and this is energy. I have a fullerene that has a different set of levels. I have a conduction and a valence band of these two. And then I'm going to assume that I can treat this bulk heterojunction, which has that ultra-complex morphology, like it's an effective semiconductor, right? That's what I'm doing. I'm going to say I only care about the electron states in this stuff and the hole states in this stuff, right? And that's a big leap, right? And that's what everyone does, and it seems to work, at least for high-performance cells. And if you look at this, you know this picture is sort of right, because if you look, if I look at the levels here, and I plot them a little bit differently, so you can see this, if I look at the quantum efficiency of these solar cells, it looks like this. So there's a spectral response here. There's a excitation in this phase, and that's here. That generates a strong excitation. It generates a lot of charge that you can pull out. There's an excitation for the fullerene. If you made a neat fullerene film, you'd say the excitation is here. It's a weak absorber due to symmetry. It's about here, and you actually still see some charge there. But what you also see is if I plot that on a log scale, I see a bunch of tail states, right? Way out here, well below the optical gap of either of these materials, I still can generate charge. And so if I look at that, that stuff is equal to basically transitions across the materials. These are interface states of the material, okay? And so every solar cell, when you go looking, you actually see this, right? And so right now, people are spending a lot of time trying to understand how to use this region of the quantum efficiency spectrum to understand what the density of states of these two things looks like. Now, and you can see this by regular optical measurement as well, using photothermal deflection spectroscopy. Now, what we do, though, we did kind of an interesting experiment, because we figured out we want to do this experiment just to show if I take any two solar cells, right, and if I have both well-performing solar cells, they have about the same optical gap of these two, what will happen is one is much more efficient than the other because the open circuit voltage is higher, because the transport level of this is shifted down. But when you go do an experiment like this, where if I send a light pulse in, and I turn the light off, and I just watch the current leak out, they're both highly efficient cells, so you might expect, they should have similar mobility lifetime products, everything should be good. But if you look at this material, which has drawn a lot of interest, what you actually see in the charge transient, when you go out to very long times, there's charges that just keep leaking out out in the millisecond regime. You only have to go 100 nanometers, okay? So obviously, it seems weird that it would take that long to get out. And the simple explanation for this is they're trapped, right? And there are a variety of models one can look at to understand this. But one model is you just say there's some extended states, and you can hop out of a trap, and then you make your way out. And when you do that, and you put in an attempt frequency for jumping out, you get kind of a number about 0.4 eV or so for that, which is kind of plausible with these tails that we see in the optical spectrum. But what's funny is, and you can know this too, because you can actually measure this with background illumination, and there are not many of these states, right? And you can do it with a little bit of light, and what happens is you can get rid of this knee, which is a deep state, just by filling up the traps. But now if I compare these two materials that nominally had the same solar cell efficiency, one of them has this knee, so this knee is the deep states, and the other one doesn't, okay? Now, it's not obvious, right? So we expect that both of these should have some deep-lying states, but this one doesn't. And it's possible there aren't any deep states in this, but we didn't think that was likely because we did that photodoping here and we could get rid of them. Well, it turns out one thing that people don't keep track of is basically these materials are a little lightly doped sometimes. And you can measure using ESR how many dopants there are, and it's something like 10 to the 15th. And that's exactly how many states it takes to wipe that out. And so what these studies are telling us is that this is something you do in conventional semiconductor physics, but it's not done routinely here, and it really impacts how you think about the transport measurements in these systems. And so we've kind of worked on this a bit. And what can we learn from transients? Well, I'm not going to show you all the numerics because it's a talk in itself. So in collaboration with Rod McKinsey and Jenny Nelson and Imperial, we've done some very complicated transport simulations of data that looks like those transients that we showed before and other types of transients where we solve the Poisson equation in a 1D model and do recombination with a Shockley-Reed-Hall mechanism and actually just try to fit all the data we have, not just one curve, light dependence, time dependence, temperature dependence, and do it self-consistently. And when you get done with that, we're finding things that previously people will say that there should be an exponential density of states or Gaussian densities of states in these. But the numerical simulation will tell you there's some structure there. Okay? Now, we don't know if that's right. I mean, this is what the simulation tells us, and we have a 1D simulation for this complex network. But what it's telling us is no matter what is true is that really the trap distribution of these materials is very complex, right? And I think this is one of the things where the field is at, where we know a lot about measuring morphology now, and we're really looking at device physics to understand exactly what that morphology does, okay? And so what's happened is I just want to tell you that, you know, in these systems, right, they're pretty dynamic. When you heat up these polymer fullerene heterojunctions, there's actually a lot going on. It's not as simple as just crystallization. We see mixing. We can use those rules to sometimes rationally choose materials. And sometimes, you know, having things that are too crystalline may not be OK, right? And I've shown you a little bit of work on trying to model these devices. And that's really just at early stage, I think. All this work, I'll show you our Nanosystems Institute. So my lab is actually here in California Nanosystems Institute, which is right here. We have to keep the research interesting because our campus is right on the beach here, as you can see. And there's some mountains in the back. And it's not all fun and games. I was telling people earlier, right, these hills catch on fire occasionally. So you know, we haven't had an earthquake in a long time either. So you know, the price you pay for this is natural disasters. And all this work is not done by me. My group does all this. So here's a picture. Neil and Mike did a lot of diffusion work. We have work by Chris Shuttle, who's not in this picture. He left. He was a postdoc who did the transient analysis, and collaborations with Fred Woodall, Craig Hawker, and Ed Kramer at UCSB, and funding from all these people. And I'd like to thank you for your attention and can take some questions, hopefully. Yeah, so it's quite interesting because this should be proportional to interface area between the two. And what you find is it's a hard measurement to do in the polymer fullerene system. It turns out you can change this a little bit, but because there's all this molecular mixing, it doesn't scale the way you think it should. We have examples now where we don't use a polymer, we use a small molecule, actually, that's crystalline, where we know there's no mixing between the two. And you can see this scale exactly with the, in a way related to the surface area. We also can, in other work, which I'm not going to show, we replace the fullerene with another type of acceptor based on decacycline. This is just work in my lab, and other people have done things as well, where it has the exact same, or the LUMO is about the same within 1/10 of a volt. And you see exactly the same subgap kind of region, although it's smaller. And we know that one is phase separated and there's not much molecular mixing, and so it agrees with that interpretation. So if you keep going down, you get to the point where roughly where you think the band tail is. Bob Street has done that quite a bit. Our setup, when we did this, we couldn't quite go out that far because of the lamp, but we can do that now. So you see this, and there's a lot of work on this. So there's Cohn van der Waal has done a lot of work on this as well, where they looked at mixed systems that do the experiment you're describing, that it scales the right way. So anyway, so now the real mystery is, you know, can you pull a lot more information out of this? There are theorists that want to know, can you say something about quantum mechanics there from this? And I'm not so convinced. That's an opinion. Yeah, so when you shine light on it, it's a good way to, the question was, does it have intrinsic fluorescence? So this one's a bad emitter, okay, but it does fluoresce. Other materials have different emission, depends on the polymer. So you can look in a blend like this, it tends to quench the fluorescence almost quantitatively. That's a good test if you have two materials to see whether you have electron transfer. But it doesn't, you know, in some cases, if the mixing isn't perfect, you will see imperfect quenching. And then you can see some emission. People use this a lot to kind of probe where the energy is moving in these materials. So I'm not as big of a photophysics guy, but a lot of people do this.
Is this energy transfer or just fluorescent quench?
Yeah, so this one, in this system, because of where the spectrum are, I mean, you can get a little bit of energy transfer there, but the electron transfer itself is ultra fast. You can see this in spectroscopy because when you look at the absorption, when you hit light here and watch the transient absorption, you see the carriers. So you know that happens. In inefficient cells, you can see processes of energy migration and other things. And so anything you can imagine, if it's possible, like Forster transfer, Depending on the cell, if the energy levels are right, you'll see that. If it's not possible, obviously you don't see it. Some of the lower gap polymers, there can't be energy transfer. Well, you can energy transfer back this way, but the absorption's so weak. It's not a critical process. But yeah, there's tons of work on this. So it's a good question. Solvent anneal. Yeah. So you can either depress the glass transition by adding a little bit of solvent, and you see different things happen. Any number of processes just to soften the film up will cause things. We don't do it typically. In some of the lower gap polymers, where the glass transition is very high, the solvent annealing will help because it depresses that, and you don't have to bake to 200 C or something. What I didn't mention is, some of these polymers, right, when people use the solvents, when they cast them, there's evidence that the polymers pre-aggregate as they're being spun cast. And so people do things where they add mixed solvents to try to control that process a bit. And then once it's cast, there are endless hoops people jump through to try to add solvents to get it to mix and so forth. In this particular system, you don't really need to do it because it's so mobile. This stuff doesn't aggregate that much. It's not very stiff, so it's not quite like a coil polymer, but it's close. Some of the stiffer chain materials are a lot more sensitive to the solvent annealing. But sometimes what will happen is if you add solvent anneal, the fullerene will get to a critical nucleation size and just nucleate and grow and make giant crystals, and that's not good either. But what we found was that depending on the fullerene you pick, you can do things to suppress that as well. So this is sort of, in the processing realm, there's not one right way to do it. And a lot of this is by spin casting of films. And so industrially, people want to do roll coating. And so you have a lot more knobs to turn. You can control the temperature of the solution. You can control the temperature of the substrate. You can control the drying. And so industrially, right, that's what you'd want to do. And people are now doing experiments like this where they go to a beam line and actually measure it while it's drying to actually see what's happening. We're not doing that so much. But yeah. So in the end, it's we just turn the brightness up on the source, right? And so part of the thing is so the grazing has this advantage that the beam spot is very tight. So if you want to do depth profiling, you pretty much have to go to a synchrotron for these types of films because of the penetration depth of the X-rays. If you want to get your data in a reasonable time scale, because these don't scatter very strongly, you more or less have to go to a synchrotron. The scattering is very weak, and so you don't see anything. So it's similar to, I didn't show any small angle scattering, which we do as well. It's kind of the same argument that, if you're going to do small angle scattering on a polymer, you could do bulk, but if you want to do a thin film, you have to go to a synchrotron because the interaction length is.
So does technically allow you to do this in film?
Yeah. So these films are maybe 100 nanometers or so thick, so that's 200 nanometers thick.
There's one thing you show that how there's one image you show there's a pi interaction.
Yep.
How do you know this is a pi interaction? How do you get this info?
Right. So the diffraction pattern, the structure of P3HT. Let's see if we go back. Yeah, here is good enough. How do I know it's pi stacking? Well, the diffraction from P3HT, for instance, is known. There's a model structure that fits the peaks.
So you just calculate the distance.
Yeah. So this is the distance. This is about 3.8 angstroms, 3.7 and change angstroms. And so it's typically assigned. It's orthogonal to this direction. You know this from the crystallography. You expect the disorder to be longest along the chain. You almost never see an along the chain peak. The chains are probably slipped relative to each other, but the order this way is good. There are other cases. We have other polymers where we have 20 spots where we can actually model out the full structure as well. And almost all of these rod polymers have pretty similar structures. Some of them are, depending on what the side chains are, they may change, but it's pretty typical. If you have too much of that, yeah, and that's seen empirically. Everyone, if you have a case where you don't see any kind of pure fullerene network, the cells are typically very inefficient. And when you look, the recombination looks bimolecular, meaning you have charges coming together.
Assuming that this is for
Yeah.
then I would think that a blunt junction will always be inferior in performance to this bilayer structure we had initially.
Yeah.
In the bilayer structure, you're only perhaps having the acceptors who are on the grain boundaries.
Yep. The trouble with the bilayer structure, and I didn't explain this that much, so if you have a bilayer, right, if you have a really strong absorber, okay, you have to get the exciton to the interface to split. And if you absorb light, and that only, an exciton can only go maybe 10 nanometers. And so you can't get enough light there. So if I had the perfect structure with, the well phase separated material, that might work. However, it's never been shown that that's efficient. I mean, Steve Forrest's group has some results that are small molecules that aren't bad, but they're never as good as this. And that's why everyone is kind of being forced in this model where you would think the mixed stuff is bad, but it's a fact that you may have this extra driving force that the electron in here gets pushed out to the edge and it won't come back. That's the best explanation everybody has right now. Nobody knows that for sure. There's some measurements where people argue they can tell you what the energy level of the fullerene is in here, and it's consistent with that, but it's not for every system. It's not been done for a lot of materials. I find that it's pretty attractive because this one, you have a lot of interface area. It agrees with the photophysics that says you split every exciton. You don't have any exciton migration. It agrees with some of the ultra-fast studies pretty well, in my opinion. One of my colleagues does not agree, but that's an argument we have. So I think that it's weird because I think every cell has this structure, and all the efficient ones that I know of have that structure. And so my feeling is that there's something good about that structure. Otherwise, we wouldn't get the high efficiency cells. If you want to go a little bit further, that's a good question, right? I mean, the fill factors are really good. I mean, you can get 75%. And if you had a real problem with this, with recombination, it wouldn't work. So that's the other empirical evidence that makes me think it's okay. But the other structure could work too, I know. But no one, to my knowledge, has really made it work. Not impossible.
So the pure pixelated thin film is the edge orientation is
Yeah.
dominant. So when you add the PCM, so the luminosity decrease. How about the orientation? Also
Yeah,
random or
there's a little bit more like this in P3HT. When you look at polymers broadly, okay, there are other polymers that have a dominant face-on orientation. And I don't think anybody knows right now, does a fullerene cause it to do one or the other? So that's why I alluded to, there are a bunch of people studying in situ experiments on deposition now and trying to understand when that happens. And there's some sense that in all these materials are aggregating in the solution, and that may be the reason why it goes this way or this way, just due to a size argument. But that's all speculation right now. I don't think anybody really knows why that happens. I have some, I can show you later. There, we have some TEM that show kind of interesting ordering in systems that is shocking, actually. So it's not, I mean, we don't know, but it happens. Yeah. So the origin of all this was, well, one, the diffusion experiment. This is a good thing about teaching. We did that because I gave out as a class problem, which was a bad idea. It turned out to be way too hard. But the students got a paper out of it, so that was good. We were actually going to try to make exactly this vertically stratified structures and study all that. And it turned out that if we zoom in on a linear scale, you do see some stratification, meaning a little more polymer or a little more at the top and a little more fullerene at the bottom. And that seemed independent of how you made the structure. So that was one of the things we were interested in. If you start with the polymer at the top, does it stay at the top? Or if you put the fullerene at the top, does the polymer wind up at the top? And the answer was it didn't seem to care. You always got the same structure. And so, not everyone gets that result. And we think it depends a bit on when the PCM nucleates and grows off the surface, actually. So it's tricky to interpret those experiments. But it doesn't seem to be a big problem. You would think it would matter more than it does, but it doesn't. So if you had too much, it's bad, but in practice, you don't get enough there to matter.
You have one question?
Yeah, in small molecule cells, it's been shown that the VOC of the cell is dependent on the mixing ratio of the donor and the acceptor. Do you think that it provides empirical evidence for this kind of possibility?
Yeah, I think I've not read these papers where people say that where the VOC is. One of the troubles I always have with the VOCs, I have to look at all the device curves because it's, since it's light versus dark, right? If you can have the VOC move a little bit depending on the exact device characteristics, and some people show enough that you can figure that out, and other people don't. So I'm not gonna. I have no opinion on that. I mean, I've seen all sorts. There's some other things where people have seen alloying behavior. We have some results that I don't have here where you can, by playing with the processing, you can move the VOC around and you can understand why it does that. And it really is due to the tail states, we think. So, no, well, so that's what's weird, right? So the charge densities is pretty low, right? So I mean, you get maybe one charge for every square, I don't know, 20, 30 nanometers. So it's pretty dilute. Right? And so the idea is that if you have, say, an excitation between these two molecules, the electron, the hole wants to be over here. And so it has a tendency to move this way statistically. The electron, if the aggregated PCBM has a lower conduction level, it has a thermodynamic driving force to get out there. And so you might think if you had all this mixed stuff, that would be bad. But if you actually did have this offset, and there's some evidence that it exists, that you would always push the electron out, and then you wouldn't go back. And you'd get just a tiny bit of boost from that. But that's, I would say, controversial. So I think there are 4 groups of us that like this picture. There are some groups that don't like that picture, mostly because it doesn't agree with their model. But theirs doesn't agree with our model, so that's So I think the things are messy, right? So it's very hard to sort this out. And so since we get this microstructure, that's why we like this. And we think it kind of is plausible. And some stuff Bob Street has been doing lately suggests that this kind of picture is okay, too. So and he was coming at it from a completely different approach. So it seemed nice that his fit in. So that's why I like it. But I could be proved wrong next month. I mean, and I would not be showing this picture. But for now, I like it.
Well, that's the final word.
Okay.
So please join me in thanking Dr. Chabinyc for a very
Okay.
interesting.
Thanks, Evan.
Well